All right, so moving on to our business items for today, we wanted to talk a little bit about the ground truthing exercise. We did get a few responses, and again, they're very helpful to us as we go through the data analysis and looking at the different methods of combining indicators so that we can identify disadvantaged communities. So if you haven't had a chance to go through that exercise, we ask that you do that for us, and we're happy to talk about it as well if you want to go over any questions you have regarding that process. So turning next, yeah.
Hi, I don't know about anyone else, but I was having trouble navigating the map. I didn't know whether or not I was zooming in close enough. I mean, part of the problem is for some of the census tracts I want to look at, I need to go closer than I was able to navigate the map. So I don't know if anyone else had similar problems, but offline it might be, well, two things. One is I would really appreciate somebody helping me navigate the map so I can actually see or make sure that the census tracts I intend to ground truth are the right ones, right? And I don't know if this would be helpful to anybody else in the working group. I don't know about anyone, I might benefit from doing this jointly with one or two others if other people are having issues or if other people haven't gotten to their ground truthing yet. Maybe even just an offline, little workshop amongst a couple of us just to make sure we're doing it correctly. So just those two problems. I had trouble navigating, and an offline tutorial might be a little helpful, at least for me, if not others.
Eddie, I'm happy to give everyone a little tutorial, and in fact, I might just videotape it, and then we can kind of send it out. But I'm also happy to meet with anyone to get into the little nitty-gritty details.
Great, thanks, Eddie, and thanks, Alex, for offering that. Next, I want to go to reflections from our previous meeting on March 24th. From that meeting, you'll recall we went through an update on the data and the analysis that we're going through. We also discussed the need of documenting as we go so that we are keeping track of all the indicators we've discussed and any data issues that we've identified with those, or any recommendations for collecting of data, future forward-looking, that we identify from our process of going through all these indicators. We also talked about combining indicators and some of the different ways you can approach that idea. From that discussion, we also heard a lot about trying to clarify some of these approaches and using visuals or other ways to make grasping these approaches a little better for us. And so today we're going to be doing a little bit of that and introducing what we're planning to do moving forward. Anyone want to bring up some discussion on the March 24th meeting or the minutes that you all received for approval? Yes, Eddie?
Hi, I suspect this is the case with some, if not all, of my fellow working group members, but I'm still intellectually and politically struggling between scenario A and B. And I was looking at the minutes, and I saw that I had, and maybe others had requested, maybe an email description of the differences to help guide me through some of the problems I'm having making a decision, or at least landing on one that's the best or the fairest approach. And I thought in the minutes it said that maybe Alex or someone was going to create a memo that was going to describe those two scenarios. If that was sent out, I never got it. And if it's not been sent out, but it will be, it'd be great to know that, because I think it I don't know about others, but I need additional help in order to make what I feel is an informed and just decision. So that's a minute's follow-up. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, thanks, Eddie, for that. We are working on that exact description, and what we realized putting it together is it kind of relates to the documenting the process as we go. So we're trying to put it together, and we are going to send it out. And I'll make sure that we follow up and make sure that you're aware when we send it out. I don't know, Alex and Amanda, do you want to comment real quick on what we're doing in terms of trying to describe those? And I know you have some great visuals for today, but.
Yeah, so we're kind of trying to tackle that in multiple ways. One is through the documentation. That's going to have a lot of different parts to it. But Eddie, what I hear from you is that you'd like something very specific, like pinpointed to a couple of the critical decisions. We're going to be covering a lot of that today, but then following today, I think it is a very good thing to kind of build on that, in either a memo or a PowerPoint deck. We sent something earlier as kind of a precursor of documentation that explains some of the things that we have done and some critical decisions we need to make. But there are so many moving pieces that kind of memo it's been documented. We have like a very long one, but let's circle back, Eddie, at the end of this and see like what we really want in that kind of a memo to you, because I think after today we'll have a bit more of a definitive feel for where the questions lie. And we have maps today, just so everyone knows.
Any other discussion on the minutes? I'm looking to see if we've got raised hands. I don't see any questions or comments in the chat box. Okay, so moving on to approval of the minutes. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes to move them to final?
This is Mary Beth, so moved.
Hi, Mary Beth. Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Great, thank you. And now, if you all will indicate your vote using the feature, the feedback feature, which is the one that looks like a little megaphone on your chat box area, and you can flip that to yes or no to indicate your vote on approving the minutes.
Hey, can you say that again? I'm sorry.
It's there's a
so
little
you know,
feature
it's a lot of our
above your.
heads. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
How do we vote? Can I just say yes?
Yes, you can say yes, but there's a little megaphone on your chat box so that I can count
I see
them.
It. Okay, thank you.
And then, the great thing is the WebEx will record it that way. Perfect, thanks. And the yeses have it. Motion approved. Thank you all. So now we're going to move into, we're going to be talking about, I know we've been very focused on the working group's role for the criteria for disadvantaged communities. The other role, very important, is with the Climate Action Council and consulting with them on climate justice. And I know we've had a couple of the panels here for that exchange between you and those panelists for what were working on as their recommendations to the Climate Action Council. And at the last meeting of the council, some of those panels did present to the council. And we have copies of those presentations that we're going to share with you all, because you will be consulting with the Climate Action Council, the date you all are holding on your calendars in June. And we wanted to talk about moving forward, what that will look like, how you want to present your comments to them. The next set of panels will be presenting at another council meeting, which the date I'm forgetting, but we will also be providing those to you as well. So there's, you can take a look at the batch that's available right now, and then there will be another batch moving forward. Alex, were there, I'm trying to remember if there was a different slide for the council. And yes, this is the one I was thinking of. We also wanted to introduce someone who can help us all with this process. We wanted to introduce a new hire that was also introduced at that Climate Action Council meeting. We have with us Samir Renate, who is the Climate Justice Advisor, and his role is really oh, sorry, I'm hearing an echo of myself, to work with us all and help ensure that there's that engagement between the council and this body, the Climate Justice Working Group, and also to be a resource to you all. So, Samir, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you. Hey, everyone. I'm deeply honored and thrilled to have this opportunity to work with all of you. I've been following, this is my 5th week of work, so I'm still drinking from the fire hose, but I've been following the work that you've been doing and really grateful for your diligence and dedication. I'm moving to New York at the end of the month. I'm in Washington State right now. And in Washington, I've done significant work around EJ advocacy, and I've helped to establish Washington's Environmental Justice Task Force and supported its work to develop model EJ policies and done listening sessions in underserved communities across Washington. And we have the health disparities map in Washington that rivals California. And I'm really excited to bring that experience to New York. And I definitely want to be an asset to you. So feel free to reach out to me anytime with any ideas or concerns or thoughts you have about stuff. Do you want to, should we go to the next slide?
Sure. Thank you, Samir.
Yeah, and the thing I just wanted to mention here is, as you know, the advisory panels are sending out their recommendations to the Climate Action Council, and to say the least, these recommendations are very voluminous. There's a significant amount of text to read through, so I'm working with the team on how we can best package those recommendations to you so you can get the gist of them and make sure to elevate any concerns or good things that you want to point out. So we'll be in touch on that soon, but just an estimate, if you were to read through all of the slides, it'll probably take you and offer your own comments. It'll probably take you between 16 to 24 hours. Thanks.
Thank you, Samir. I want to, turn to the working group now. And Eddie, I see you have your hand raised. I just want to hear from you all on the advisory panel recommendations and the process we're trying to create for your feedback. So Eddie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, and welcome, Samir. I thought I heard something. I just want to make sure that I heard properly. I heard what I thought I heard was that a synopsis or some sort of distillation of the working group recommendations that'll go to the CAC will be shared with us. If I'm understanding that correctly, while I appreciate what I would assume is the intent to make it easier and more streamlined for us, I would like to see the fullness of the committee recommendations. I'm growing increasingly concerned that some of the recommendations either are not reflective of some of the committee members. I don't know how much of these recommendations in some of the committees reflect true consensus or not. And I'm also a little concerned that some of these recommendations may in fact fly in the face of the actual CLCPA. So I think in order for us to assess that, a more full rather than a more limited or constrained sharing of the recommendations might be useful.
Thanks, Eddie. You're going to be receiving both. So you're going to get the full package. So we have the first batch for you. So that might be a good way to spread it out. So you'll get this first batch. And then Samir is putting together as another resource for everyone, a little synopsis and different way of organizing it to make it helpful for you as you go through all of the recommendations from the panels. Any other questions, comments from the working group?
Yeah, this is Sonal. Just a quick question, like around when we'll expect that? Hi, Samir. When we'll expect that from you, Samir, or just sort of just a general timeline so we can plan around spending a lot of time looking through it? That would be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonal. So you'll be receiving today the first batch of the full recommendations from that group of panels that has already provided theirs. Samir, I'm not sure when you'll have your synopsis, but So the full package, the full first batch will be coming now. And then the second batch will be coming probably later, around May 10th that week is when the other panels are going to be ready to go.
I'd say probably in the next or two for mine. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Rosa, could I ask then, so in terms of the actual interaction with the Climate Action Council, who is speaking on our behalf and how, and what do we need to like, how are we packaging our remarks or comments for them?
And that's what I wanted to have you all discuss. You all were sent a date to hold so that you can be the ones engaging with the council yourselves. You know, Chris and I and Neil and Joe will also be there. So the question is, do you want to work together to combine a written response? Do you just want to discuss the recommendations together? Because we can do that at one of the May meetings, if that's helpful. One of the meetings coming up before June. Eddie's giving a thumbs up. Any other thoughts on that process?
This is Jared. I would be in favor of a written response, or at least having that as the starting point to consolidate our thoughts and recommendations.
This is Elizabeth. I would say both. I think we need a written response from the collective, and I think that we need a presentation from EJ leadership, CJ leadership.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And Rawa is agreeing with you in the chat. Hi, Rawa.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, great. So what we'll do as we plan out the May meetings, and thank you all for getting me your availability. We should have those set up at least by the end of this week so we can hold those dates on your calendar, is we can plan for discussion at least on the first batch because the earlier May meeting, we might not have the second batch available, or we might not have had enough time to digest everything that came in that package. So I think it might be best to set it up for the later May meeting for us to have that back and forth on all of the panel recommendations. Does that work for everyone? Okay, great. Thank you all, and let's move forward, Alex. I know we're going to be discussing the timeline and what's ahead for us. Just want to remind ourselves of all the work that we have currently going on. I know in our work plan, it wasn't as detailed. So now as we're working, we're understanding all of the things we have to do to complete the task of coming up with the criteria for disadvantaged communities. So we have our ground truthing process that we ask you all to engage in. We are going to be coming up with draft scenario maps, and that's something the working group would review. We also would like to continue with the one-on-ones. We know that some of you have found those very helpful, and we definitely find those very helpful to hear from you all on what you need from us as support for this work and what you want in terms of the indicators and what we're missing and those kinds of things. And then we have thinking about our public engagement. Once we have the draft ready, there will be public meeting materials for everyone to review. And then following up on that, once we receive all the comments through the public process, there's a review of the draft documentation and review of those comments as they come in as well. We also wanted to sort of tee up the decisions that we see are involved in this work as well. So some of the things we'll be thinking about is when you designate, so for example, in California and in other tools we've seen, they'll go through their scoring method and then they designate the percentage. So what percentage of these census tracts are the disadvantaged communities? So that's a decision point that the working group needs to be aware of. we also know that we've had a lot of discussion about what does our distribution of disadvantaged communities look like regionally. So there's decision points that have to be made on, do we go through this work and have the outcome just be what it is based on the indicators and the method, or do we try to do something so that we're getting more regional distribution? The other important piece of this is consensus on the indicators that will be determining the census tracts that you will designate, right? So we have to come to consensus on the indicators. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on that, though. We want to be able to see it visually. So that's something that we'll be working on as we move forward. And then there's consensus on the approach, or sometimes we refer to it as how we combine those indicators. And then finally, consensus on the scenario, which is another way of saying how the distribution looks like on a map when you have the indicators you've decided on and the approach of combining that you've decided on. Alex and Amanda, any other descriptions on this work, maybe some clarification on the terminology that I used?
I'd really love to, I think one of these, some of the clarity of the decisions that we have to make ahead will be described throughout this process, so, or throughout today. So one thing is, the proportion, the distribution, and the consensus on the approach are things that we want to talk about today because they're pretty darn important. So if anyone has any questions right now, I also know that the chat is full right now, so I want to kind of give space to people who may want to be saying something instead of chatting, if there is.
I think, thank you, Alex, for raising the chat. I think the concern that you're seeing from CJWG leadership is that we need to put on the agenda this conversation about benefits versus investments. We're in the situation right now where we're faced with 40% when that should not be the ceiling. It should be the baseline. And we need to talk about how that's done. We need to spend some time so that we can make recommendations about how that's done. That I think that's integral to this body. And I know that Rawa and Eddie, I don't know if you guys want to add to that.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This is Rawa. Yes, I think everything that you listed out in the concerns, in particular, as we're learning from California and others where what they'd hoped their strategies would actually benefit communities and what the reality on the ground is. And also, I think the other difficulty of it, especially as we've been talking to the Biden administration and others around this question of investments versus benefits, is in New York State and in the CLCPA, it is not clear how much funding is even available. What is the 40% of, right? Or 35% with a goal of 40 of. And so as we are creating these criterias, we can inadvertently create, greater inequities or just false solutions around, expectation and reality. And so I think it's important for us to address that, have some clarity around it. And I think it will both help our setting what the criteria that is available for implementation, but also what are the other strategies over the many years that this will be happening.
If I could chime in also, yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, there's a reason why the first version of this law that was introduced by the Assembly and Senate talked about investments and not benefits to avoid this exact moment, right? And what you're hearing is that this the inclusion of this squishier benefits language not only now has made our lives in New York unnecessarily complicated, but it's now jumped into the national space, and now nationally, the confusion that we're seeing in New York is being replicated, and it's totally not only unnecessarily, but it's totally fixable. Look, there's nothing in the law that says, as far as I can tell, I'm not a lawyer, so I want to get the legal analysis from others, but there's nothing in the law that prevents the interpretation of the 35 to 40% to be direct investments. If we if our working group, if the Climate Action Council, if we all agree that it should be direct investments, not only will that make all of our lives that much easier, including, frankly, state agency people that have to figure this stuff out, but the transparency for New Yorkers will be such that we'll be able to then hold each other and government and everyone else accountable. The benefits language is going to invite some sort of formulaic overlay that is going to is bound to be non-transparent and subject to all kinds of frankly, Monday morning quarterbacking and second guessing. So I think that we have all from the beginning said that it should be investments in our benefits. And I think that there's a number of and I think ultimately, we can interpret the law in such a way where it's not, there's nothing in the law that bars an investment, an investment framework for the CLCPA implementation investments.
Thanks all of you for that. And I know we have in the little green box on the bottom that we do need time for talking about that exact question, the investments and benefits. And I think we're okay with, Chris, you teed up in the chat that we could do in May a discussion on the investments benefits piece.
Yeah, hi everybody. Yeah, so I think I agree with the points that you all raised in terms of just needing to understand how we're going to be operationalizing this. I mean, because that has implications for the rest of the work. So, and I think you all know last month, I think I mentioned the state team is trying to pull together kind of a number of considerations for kind of the investments criteria, as well as how we could think about the benefits. So, putting this on the next agenda for conversation, I think makes sense. We could pull together kind of the, current, framing that, the state team is kind of working through, and then start that conversation in terms of, what makes sense, and, how do we, collectively start to, think about this together. And I'll just say, I think we need more than a half an hour conversation on it. So I think dedicating, a large portion of the next meeting would be good.
Let's make that happen.
Thanks, Chris.
So I just wanted to add, thank you for this. And I think that having this conversation is actually what we need to have for you all to make the decisions that need to be made for the designations and the criteria that we have. So we'll make sure that that has a bulky part of it. Rosa, do you want to chat about timeline, or you want me to go forth?
Yeah, why don't you go forward with the timeline slide. And I know Alex and Amanda put a lot of work into this. And I do just want to note that the triangles aren't exact dates. They're more indicating sort of like the week of, because I know we haven't finalized the meeting dates for May, but those are the weeks that so far look like have the most availability for the working group. So that's why they're highlighted. But go ahead, Alex.
So Amanda and I made this timeline, which I will freely admit makes us nervous. So I will say this, each gray box is a week. The triangles, the green ones are Climate Justice Working Group meetings. The blue is the CAC work. Those that are like more transparent and dashed have not been scheduled yet. And here is what we think has to happen every week for us to get to a decision by July 5th. And this is like the happy view. Like if everything works out really well, if we're able to get all the data in line at the same time. Because today we still don't have some of the critical decisions. that we need, or the critical indicators that we need to give you the final maps, or at least the first draft of the maps that we feel comfortable or confident are what we have discussed. And so at this point, we're still trying to like kind of cover off some of the decisions we know you will have to make. And we've made maps and have some examples, but we don't have everything. But then May 10th, or that week of the May 10th, if we get that meeting, that will be the first look at the draft scenarios. And now I think we also need to add into there a solid chunk of investments and benefits discussion as well. And then what we will be needing from each of you is solid time to review all the documents and the maps that we give you in between the meetings. And what we're hoping to do is to have a lot of iterations so that we can hone in on what is most important to you all. That includes giving you a draft maps and scenarios, you coming back with feedback, we do it again, you going and looking and giving us feedback, then we do it again. That type of work, I think, is really vital for us to get this right. But needless to say, I think what's most important is really nailing down these dates so that we have this time set for us and we know where to work with on the timing. So, Rosa, I fully am okay if everyone wants to like actually agree on a May 10th date now. I'm happy with that because it would be so nice, or a week of the May 10th, that week. Just because we so need to nail these down so that we can continue working through this.
Thanks, Alex. Looking at the working group for reactions, scrolling through cameras, looks like we see some nodding heads, thumbs up.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So let's just set that one in stone. We got to get the rest of them done. But one of the things I want to flag on the timeline here is that we anticipate that this is going to be, and I think you all know this, a significant time investment to look through the maps, look through some of the documentation and explanation each time. And I think it's a lot to ask of you every week to have to put this through. And so I wanted to get your reactions on the speed of this. We're trying to make this so that we can get a decision or, approve the draft scenarios that we'd pull out in the week of the 5th of July. But is this something that's realistic? I'd rather set a realistic timeline now. And Eddie, I just saw your comment. Totally agree. We should set something up, I think, for next week for the ground truthing. Leaning into the uncomfortable silences because I really want everyone to see the amount. We're working full steam ahead, but it also means that we'll just need to go back and forth an awful lot. If you're all okay with that and teeing up, the summer is going to be early summer and spring are going to be, yep. Sorry, Abby. None of us are on vacation until July.
I had a quick question, Alex. How long do we think that meeting on May 10th is going to be? Is it just going to be a regular 2 hour, or is it going to be something longer? I imagine it might be a little bit longer. So if we can start planning those now, would be really helpful.
So, Raul, right now, when I sent the poll, it was for 2 hours. If we think we can get another hour in there, I'm happy to schedule that, but I'd like to hear from the working group members because I know it's very difficult to get a 3 hour chunk of time in your day. I see Amanda has her hand raised.
So not listed on that agenda is investments and benefits. So I think, 1 hour for investments and benefits, 1 hour for draft scenarios, and 1 hour for advisory panelists is a lot of content. I'm also wondering, in addition to extending that meeting, if people would want to do, an hour the week of May 3rd. I mean, alternatively, we just wait until May 10th. We don't cover that and we kind of extend the rest of the timeline.
So I just want to respond. This is particularly hard for EJ organizations that do so much with so little and who are being pulled in a lot of different directions. So this is where privilege becomes a real thing, right? Where we know that organizations with big funds and who have a lot of departments and a lot of resources are able to give up staff to do this. So for us, it's a sacrifice. But I do think that it's a sacrifice that we're willing to make because we think that this is tremendously important. And so we're hoping that people will give the time to set aside to have this hard conversation because it needs to be had. And things are moving really quickly. And this work group is moving really slowly because this is so complex. But I'm just really concerned that the train will leave without us. And so, yeah, I think we have to do it. We're just going to have to dig in and do it. And I can just speak for all of us who come from the EJ movement. This is hella hard for us because we don't just literally on Earth Day tomorrow, there's a private company that wants to bring in C&D into Sunset Park on Earth Day. So that's our light. So I just want to flag that because we don't, vacations, whatever, we have to put that off for this.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Others on that, I can try to get us another hour on that date, or as I think Amanda suggested, we could pull an hour on a separate day.
If I can also just add, yes, everything that Elizabeth said. Also, you have to remember we're like the executive directors of EJ organizations, which is a whole other ball of wax. But that said, I do think that this is critical work, and it would be really, really helpful to send whatever materials in advance as soon as they become available, even if it's just the draft scenarios or, whatever it is, because sometimes when they're sent, just within, just trying to find the time, right? So we have to try to make that work for us on our end, however we can. So if we can send that, or if there are any prompts and things like that through email that can be sent to us in advance, that would be really, really helpful. And I'm down to finding an extra hour either on May 10th, preferably, and or another time.
And if I could just add one other request, and that is to the extent that we can get all of these dates on the calendar sooner rather than later so we can plan around them, even we can schedule out through July, then we can adjust our lives accordingly.
Yes, please. It's really hard to have these dates thrown a couple of weeks in advance. It's, and I agree, we all want to do the work. Large chunks of time, I think, are more difficult. Smaller chunks can be easier to find within a week.
So I'm hearing a couple things. One is, Rawe, we hear you, all of you actually, to getting everything in advance as much as possible. And that's actually something that we critically want to be working toward. Right now we're working basically at the moment of things, but we need to really, really make it so that before that May 10th meeting that we've got something for you to pre-read and to tee up some things. So I'll make that commitment right now to send that out to you. And we'll try really, really hard to get it as soon as possible. One thing that I will very clearly state is that we're not right now, the GIS work that's happening on the very critical indicators, we're not scheduled to get those data until the very end of April, which we're setting up literally everything that you'll be seeing today with the maps. We're setting all that up so that we can put them in and then work through it. But there's inevitable cleaning and analysis to make sure it works. So what makes me really nervous is trying to get all that beforehand and send it to you. But I will make the commitment right now of saying that's really important. And we are asking a huge commitment. We know this is hard. That's part of the reason why I wanted to spend a good chunk of time today looking at this very scary schedule, and because we know it's such a big ask, but also feel that it's critical need to do it. So if you are willing to, let's schedule that May 24th one. If we have the May 10th, week of May 10th one done, then let's just get right now, the May 24th one in. I'd rather spend that time making sure that that there's blocks that work for everyone and get that on the calendar now. Rosa, are there times specific on May 24th that we have?
There are, but I'd have to pull it up to remind myself. And I have, I think by now I have everyone's availability on the poll. So that could be the first thing we follow up with on after this meeting is the dates that we've selected.
Okay, that sounds good. As far as follow up, so we will select times and dates for the week of the May 10th and the week of May 24th, and very quickly start also sending polls out for the week of the June 21st and then the week of July 5th to get those through as well.
And we can add July also.
Yep.
We'll just plan out your whole summer.
Okay. So now that we have this, just want you all to know we hear you. It is a big one. Adding investments in there is going to add some more to it too. So we will do this together. I'm not doing anything this summer, but this. Okay. Next step. So I think we've said this, but we want to be clear about what we're working on. We're reducing the number of indicators that are kind of pulling into the model of the scenarios. We still are missing some very critical indicators, and we're getting those there. We have created at least the beginning of a Tableau interface. That means, Eddie, the maps are going to get a little crazier, but actually more informative for you. So in this tutorial, I'm going to make extra tutorials for you so that we'll make it as easy as possible for you to like look through them and you won't have to like bang your head against the technology. And then, you know, it's evaluating those scenarios once we get them out to you. But you'll see a preview of kind of what we can do. It's still in process, but that's what we're really, really working on. The ground truthing really helps us because we have so many different ways of integrating the indicators together, how we add them together, all those different parts, all those little decisions really make a big difference on what gets selected in those different models as a DAC. And so knowing that there's this one community that really should be a DAC, but it's not showing up, helps us know something's wrong with that model and we need to go back and fine tune it. So it's huge. Okay. Here we are in their circle. I feel like we've like gone in those little circles. We're still there in the test, iterate, optimize, where as soon as we get those final pieces of data, it will really help us to be able to figure out where we're really at. Because right now we've got some pretty good models, but they're missing some very critical pieces of information. And those critical pieces are really the environmental and climate risk indicators. And those are the ones that we're trying to figure out what needs to go in there to model that. And we're also working with different experts to identify which of the indicators we have are the best ones for the models for the scenarios that we're creating. So we're really working on kind of this data and indicator front. We're also working on the how do we put things together front. So like we want the data to be the best we have, the indicators to be the best ones we can get. And then we also want to figure out, well, how do we combine things? And and I know we keep harping on the how do we combine things part. I think often in this type of work, people obfuscate that. And they just focus on the indicators and the data feeding into it, and they don't necessarily talk so much about the scoring and the designation. I can tell you right now, that is a huge component of how things are going to play out. And so part of the reason we're bringing it to the fore is that you can manipulate these data if you're not careful. And so we want to be as transparent as possible about those decisions that we're making and that we want you to be thinking about and making so that you know all the things that could be manipulated and make sure that there is there as possible and that you are all in on all those decisions. So these are the indicators we're still waiting on, and I think they're really, really important ones, particularly the health ones, the premature death and low birth weight. And then we're also looking at storm surge, sea level rise, flood risk in particular. Those are the ones that I think are going to be particularly important for us and for the modeling that we have. So all this to say that we have a lot of things that once we get them in are really going to change the scenarios. This is what's backing us up right now. Needless to say, I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but it makes me nervous. Like we have this stuff that's like we're so ready to get it. As soon as we get it, we can roll through there. So I'm going to show you some maps today, and as we zoom through, and I'm going to zoom in, and you guys can look at different neighborhoods and tell me stuff. You'll be like, "That's totally missing. What's going on?" Or like, "That is so wrong." That's because we don't have everything in here. But hopefully, the concepts will be made clear, which is what I want to get at right now. Any questions so far before I move on? As far as timing, is right now, we're supposed to get these at the end of the month. As soon as we get them, we're gonna, no, Amanda, you're shaking your head.
Only the health stuff is coming in at the end of the month. The other things, you know, we're still looking, you know, we have proxies. We're going to start to find proxies for climate so we can represent climate, but it, you know, there's a lot of complexities in how we can decouple a few things from FEMA data for our needs, and then custom variables, and then environmental hazards. Again, we're going to use proxies for now and try to, you know, get more custom state analysis later. We've had a lot of great productive discussions with a lot of technical experts on all these types of data at the Department of Environmental Conservation, people with expertise in certain pollution burdens, air toxics, hazardous facilities. We've had discussions with public health and epidemiologists at the DOH. We're talking to climate change experts at multiple agencies this Friday, and we're actively talking with FEMA to see if we can use federal data in the short term. And in all cases, you know, we're just hearing experts kind of tell us that some of the data we think might be national data or federal data really might not represent what we think it represents, and want to suggest alternatives. So we're just kind of figuring out what are the really high priority things we need to create our own custom variables for. And then there's a, you know, additional analysis process of figuring out, you know, and actually executing on those custom variables.
And adding to that,
happening.
Yeah, it's a lot. And I would say that this is like an ongoing, we've been doing this for months, right? Having these conversations, it's almost like as we peel the onion, more things pop up, and we start realizing that, oh, that's also based on model data. And so that's not accurate. This is where, Eddie, that kind of memo that was meant to be just focused on the scenarios kind of started getting into a larger documentation of, oh my goodness, this is not a data point that we want to use right away, or we want it better. And so that's where that's coming through. But we are also wanting to adjust some of these data points so that they do fit into our GIS work. So there is shapefile work that's happening right now to take some of the data points and then cover it so that we have it in the same format. So there's a lot of crazy technical things. Needless to say, it makes me really nervous that we're still trying to kind of go through and get these data points. But I think what's so important here is getting as good as we can for this time period to hit that July deadline, and then also documenting what data points we also feel like need to happen, be collected and figured out for the next iterations, because none of this is perfect now. It will be good, but it's going to be better as we go, and we need to make those data recommendations as we go as well.
Yeah, and I, you know, trying to get expertise and opinions now to poke holes in some of the indicators, knowing that as soon as we post things for public comments, we're going to get 100 comments on every indicator and 1,000 comments on what we didn't include. I mean, just looking at California's experience. So trying to make sure we understand the data now before we go forward with that recommendation. I mean, even then, I think, we will get a lot of feedback and comments as we get even more eyes on this, even more experts reviewing with very specific expertise.
For our models, the flood risk, storm surge, and premature death are, I think, particularly important for us right now. So we really are trying to find ways of getting that in. Okay, I belabored this enough. If anyone has any comments, happy to chat. If not, I will move on.
Just a quick question. Given that some of these data points are not going to be available even at the end of April, how do you anticipate this potentially affecting our meeting on May 10th and some of those conversations? And I want let the record show that the pace here is not just being dictated by the working group, but by bad, insufficient, not fitting data. So it's
Oh, yeah.
I want to make sure everybody knows it ain't just the working group. But can you guys expound on that? It sounds like are we gonna have are you guys gonna have all the data even by the 10th, or it sounds like you may not, right?
I think what we're thinking is we'll have the data to represent the key concepts. So right now, we don't really have anything that represents coastal flood, storm surge risk, climate change risk. So if we showed anything now, we expect, it might be really geographically skewed and really change when we have some of the coastal risk indicators. So what we're hoping for is we can find something that kind of represents that. So kind of shifts the geography a little bit. I think, in other cases, I think getting that final health data will be awesome. So that said, we're thinking that we're going to have the data that represents the key concepts we're trying to represent, even if we don't have quite the level of detail and kind of the perfect values of things. And then we're going to try to look and prioritize better state level data for climate and environmental hazards to use kind of in the short term for this summer, with the idea that, there's like a third opportunity kind of after or in a future year to improve it further.
And Eddie, I'm just gonna lead into the whole it's totally the data and not at all the working group that's delayed this. I mean, if we had these models a month ago, we would have showed them to you. It's just this. And so finding as good at proxies as we can for the things that we can't get direct measures again, and then also being as transparent as possible, being here's what we have, here's why it's good enough, here's what we want, and here's how it should be measured if we can, is how we want to kind of document things as much as possible, because we got to run, Elizabeth said it best, people are going, we need to be there. And I think people are looking to New York. Let's make sure that it's as good as we can to do this. Okay, so this is my big disclaimer slide. The maps you see again today, when you're dude, why is, I don't know. We have kind of a running joke of the East Hamptons, if that gets chosen as a DAC, clearly we've done something wrong. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, it is 9:04, and now we're going to get into some of the cool things that we need to talk about. So having heard my big disclaimer, we've got 3 different main questions I want to talk through today, and then go through some examples of what this might look like for you all. Also, Amanda's 9 to 5 reference GIF here. One of the reference slides that we sent to you earlier this week were not meant to be something you read beforehand, but rather a leave behind so that you could have them as a reference as we start thinking to it. And we're going to build those out. Okay, moving on. I want to talk through kind of the fact that combining the data really is a step process. This really goes to that transparency of the approach. In California, what the Calvido screen has done is to have these kind of larger order pollution burden and population characteristics. They mirror pretty similarly our idea of having a kind of environmental burdens and risks and vulnerabilities, so that we have those different components, and that each as we designate different communities, that they need to be high in both, but they absolutely need to have the vulnerabilities component in particular. And I think that this is going to be a really important thing to be thinking through. So this is why we're dividing things up into burdens and vulnerabilities. This slide's going to look a little crazy, but the idea here is that we have these different indicators and they each speak to different parts. So the pillars that we've talked about, the different parts, there's different indicators that speak to environmental burdens or disinvestment in neighborhoods or climate change burdens that are going to happen. And on the vulnerability side, there are different indicators that speak to income, demographics, health. And each of those feed into these larger groups, these larger concepts of an environmental burden and a vulnerability score. And then we take those scores and then we add them or multiply them together to create an overall score. And then we take the top highest scores of those and then designate those a DAC. That is the general overview of the approach that we've been talking through the last couple months. But there are some pretty big decisions throughout this part. So don't let this slide kind of bog you down. I want to kind of break down some of the different decisions in here. To start with, I'm going to start at the very end and say, okay, well, if we look at this pie and then we look at the quarter versus not, how many different communities should we designate as a DAC? Should it be 25% or 30% or 40% of the communities that we designate a DAC or not? And I want to show you how this is going to look. So can everyone see this map? Isn't it beautiful?
By the way, look at what happens when you get to New York City. It's one huge. It's awful.
I know.
Keep going. Sorry.
It's all good. It's all good. So I'm actually going to go there for you in this little arrow thing, which is tiny. So I apologize. It's tiny. This is why I now have reading glasses. Okay, so you have this little zoom thing with a little magnifying glass thing. You click on that, and then you can make a little box, and then it goes woo like that. Okay, so ignore the colors right now because I don't want you to be thinking colors right now. I just want you to be thinking of what this might look like if right now we've got the top 25% of, so right now we have 25% of the kind of the scores being designated a DAC. And so you'll see the color shift if I take this and I say basically for this one, if I put it down to 60, so that means then 40% of the communities are going to pop in. And it takes a while.
By the way, I don't know if folks saw, but I think Jared dropped a question that may be on multiple minds.
Mm-hmm. So this is the why have an arbitrary number or percentage? Jared, I think that's a totally legit question. What we can do is look at the shape of the distribution of scores after they fall out and start looking at it. I think that is one of the things that we've done is kind of create it so that this is ranked. But I think in some ways, we shouldn't hold ourselves, or you shouldn't hold yourselves to like, oh, it has to be 25% just because that's how California did it. I think that you can definitely look and get a sense of the feel of, oh, okay, well, is this where your ground truthing comes in? If we expand the criteria so that more communities are designated a DAC, then how do we make sure that that's real or not, right? So in this case, if I reduced it down so that you had more communities come in, you see the map gets colored more. And I think it's entirely okay to say that this would be something, sorry, it's going to take a minute, that this is something that we can look at as the scenarios fall through. And I do want to say that no decision has to be made today, but I do want to explain the thoughts of as we go through, and especially when we have the conversations about investments and benefits, the idea here, I think, is that you have more designations, more communities being designated a DAC, then less funding is going to go to some of those. So that's the thing you have to weigh. If you have more neighborhoods or more areas, communities doing this, then less money might go to some of the critical ones. I have no good answer. It's an entirely a decision that needs to be discussed and talked through.
Yeah.
Eddie, you had was there? Sorry, Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, Jared's question is so good and was a fundamental question we've been struggling with since the beginning of this. It gets back to this idea that there is no right answer. There is no model. There is no existing formula to say you put in this data and you get out a clear, this is a DAC, this is not a DAC. So it really comes back to understanding that what we're doing is like really a relative screening process or a relative ranking process. We're looking at a bunch of data and looking at what communities have higher values of that data, but not necessarily saying that for any one point of data or one combination of variables, a certain score means it's high risk and the score right next to it means it's low risk. Like we don't have a process where we're drawing a line for every variable or overall that says this is definitely vulnerable, this is definitely not vulnerable, or this is definitely a hazard, this is not a hazard, because it would take a lot of work to get to the point that we have that kind of like scientific line in the sand or consensus to define that. So, I mean, we can look at the distribution of scores, but really what this process is resulting as is kind of like a relative ranking. So looking at, we'll end up with kind of relative scores of each community on burdens and threats. So what are kind of the external environmental climate burdens and risks that each community faces, and we'll have kind of this relative rank ordering of population vulnerabilities and health characteristics, and we have the combination of those, but we don't necessarily have an answer for where, what score represents absolute risk or what score represents absolute vulnerability. It is really tricky.
Super tricky, but super vital. And I think, the relative comparison allows us to make a comparison between, community A and community B in this way, right, Amanda? Right. That's how it feels, but it's also, we can shift that if we need to make it more of a objective measure. I think right now having this kind of rank ordering allows us to put everyone on the same spectrum and then say, okay, well, this community is different from this community. And then you can take the top X% and look at that. But again, I think this is where the ground truthing is going to be really, really helpful, because then you can start seeing like, okay, even if you allow for 40% of the communities to come in, that feels better because it's covering in a better way, even with all the indicators, even with all the approach. If you just are not getting the coverage you need, because there are so many disadvantaged communities in this area, then I think that 40% is what you go with, like it's an entirely decision up to you.
Can the problem I keep having, and hopefully as the weeks go on, something will emerge to kind of fix some of my own ambivalence about this. But it sometimes feels when we look at our different options, it feels like some of these options almost punishes New York City for its density, if that makes any sense, right? I mean, if you look at the population, at the poverty line in New York City, we're talking about over 1,300,000 people. That's the amount of people living in poverty in New York City, which poor people in New York City alone is larger than the populations of DC and Atlanta, another city combined, right? So it's the very real presence of the density of disadvantaged communities in New York City that gives me pause when we start looking at some of the other options. But by the same token, I want to make sure that other parts of the state are, feel like that they are also included. And so anyway, that I keep coming back to that. And apologies for the open musing here, but it's that to me is part of the problem, is that if we've got these kinds of numbers in New York City, it's a very real consideration for me. I'll stop there.
It's a really big consideration, full stop. Like, it is one of the things that we're trying to really grapple with. And so let me go back to here and talk through the next question, which you were like my plant to talk through, is regional parity, and trying to then understand, well, do we want to make sure that others are represented or not? So these are old maps. See, like yesterday, literally, we were updating the data. And so I grabbed these maps yesterday and then I updated the data. So bear with me. The blue on the left is kind of the idea that we put rules in place to make sure that there are DACs in rural areas. And then the map on the right is actually more kind of like letting the data lie where it is, like letting the chips fall where they are. And that means actually that you have a much larger percentage of the DACs going to New York City. I'm going to show you this on a map, and then we'll zoom into different places. And I want to go to lots of different places. So bear with me here. I'm going to go to, come on, you can do it. There's a lot of data it's chugging through here. It's impressive. Okay, here it is. It's very exciting. One of the things I wanted to show you here is that we have three different things going on at this point on this map. We've got things that we took basically two different scenarios. One where we like made the restrictions so that there absolutely had to be DACs outside of New York City. And then there's others that didn't. So let me actually, can't actually show it. Okay. I'm going to zoom in to New York City because it will actually help to show what's going on here. So I'm going to zoom in a bit more. If I take out the regional, sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. If I take out the regional kind of strong arm, what we see here, the strong arm, I don't know where that came from, but it feels like we're like constricting things. So just roll with my special language bits. Come on, you can do this. So if we go through, I want to show you that the orange, coming back in here, is what would be designated a DAC for both scenarios, for a regional scenario and a statewide scenario. Then the green are in the scenario where we ran it for just where the chips fall. Then the green get added as areas that are DACs within just that kind of like where there's no regional restriction. If we took out that statewide and actually put in just the regional component, that's where the blue comes in. Then you see New York City doesn't have any green anymore. It all kind of gets pushed out to other areas, and that's where those blue areas go. And that's the next question we have for you, which is, how do we divide this? There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. I am going to give you a can't we have our cake and eat it too answer, which is what constrains us from running both models and then adding them together. So let me kind of go forward on that one a bit. So if we took this, and I am going to take a view of the larger state, and we have, if we did just the statewide where we have no regional parts, you're going to see a lot of the blue go away. So a lot less blue here. This is kind of where we're at. If we have the regional restrictions in there, this is what the map would look like. And then entirely the green is all in New York City, so you wouldn't see that. But what if we allowed both to happen so that you had all of those in New York City still designated, all those greens still there to add because they are realistically DACs, but then you also had the regional component as well. So that's my cake and eat it too solution. It's not as pretty as like, hey, we ran one model, here's what it is, but it also is something that I think could be potentially a more equitable solution, generally speaking. Does this make sense to people? It's a lot.
Alex, I'm sorry, but you did kind of lose me on that last part.
Totally. Okay. So let me go through it again. I kind of wish that I could change the colors so you could do this. Like, let's just look at what the map would look like if we had a regional breakdown. And that meant that regional breakdown means that we are making sure that outside of New York City, a certain number of communities are designated a DAC, right? And so in this case, this is what it would look like. Pretend that the blue and the yellow and the orange are the same color. This is what it is. So these neighborhoods, these different communities and areas are then designated a DAC. New York City would then have all of this that is orange. And that might be enough, but it also means that there is a smaller proportion of the DACs that are coming through in New York City because we've constrained it that way. Objective, like just, we've just made that the rule. So that's kind of a regional solution where we break it down and basically say, no, there must be a certain number of DACs that come outside of New York City. And that's what this map looks like. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what it would be if we just let the data be what they are. Elizabeth, I love your comment there. It's totally true. It's also really hard to talk through and explain because it's so complex, right? I'm so there with you. And here's my coffee. It hasn't been drunk yet, so maybe that's part of the issue. Okay,
Alex,
so yeah.
Alex, it's Chris. Yeah, sorry. My hand, I can't raise my hand in the WebEx environment. I don't know why. But maybe, so is it really I guess two things, right? Are we looking at the top quartile of communities or the top percentile of communities that meet the criteria in the regional view? So we're basically taking the communities and basically setting the percentile based on what the region composition looks like. So that's that was view one. Mm-hmm. And then the view two is forget about the regional compositions, just what's the state composition and taking the top percentile or quartile based on that. So that's really the difference between these two views?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it.
Got that, but I was trying to.
No. I think I got too excited to get to the map where I didn't lay the groundwork of what this was. But the idea here is say we have two scores, one for not the rest of the state and then New York City, and then we take the top quartile of the rest of the state and then New York City, and that was that regional one. So you're absolutely right about that. And then the other one is okay, for Chris's interpretation. I'm going to draw pictures next, so bear with me because this is going to be on the fly, but that's the best teaching way anyway. The statewide one is okay, we calculated everything. Here's the percentile set, right? So here's all of the communities, all the census tracts ranked. And then we're taking the top quartile of just all of those census tracts. So let me go back here, and I'm going to go back down to, we got rid of it. Okay. Bear with me because I'm going to make something. Okay, so let's just pretend that this is the regional stuff. So we've got 2, and this is rest of state. And here we've got New York City. And what we do here is basically take this top quartile of the scores and we say, thou shalt be a DAC. And this is what that regional one will say, right? As opposed to the full statewide one, where we basically just take the full top quartile being the top 25% of census tracts that have the highest scores, the highest threat and vulnerability scores. So again, we're kind of like skipping through all the craziness of like, hey, we calculated this overall score. Now we have that overall score, and we're just taking that top bit off and saying, you are going to be a DAC. The first thing we talked about here was, well, you could make that a quartile, the quartile being the 25%, or you can make it bigger or smaller. And Jared recommended that we, like, it seems very arbitrary, and it entirely is. So you can choose different things here. This is what makes this so technically challenging, is there's so many different things that you can tinker with. And that's what's so hard about this. Amanda, you want to jump in?
I will say when California was looking at draft scenarios, they gave themselves the ability to look at different thresholds. So they said, okay, let's have everyone look at what happens if you put it at 25%, 30%, 35%. So we have that option too of, like when we say scenarios, there's a lot of levers we can tweak. A scenario could be using different variables. It could be regional versus statewide scoring, or it could be different thresholds.
What's so hard to describe here, I think, is that this right here, why are not going to let me do this right, is one way of us looking at things, where we constrain things with the idea that, with full acknowledgement that if we have the indicators and just the data as they are, a lot of the neighborhoods, communities that are designated a DAC will end up being in New York City. And so that's kind of the idea here with the statewide one. They're predominantly in New York City. In this model right here, it's kind of saying, well, we get that, but we also think that it's important to make sure that other communities are also designated a DAC. Again, no right or wrong answer on this, so I want to flip back to the idea that this is what it would look like. So if this is the case and you just had the statewide one, you see that there's not a lot of color across the state. It's not necessarily bad, because frankly, like if you look at here, something that would be designated a DAC outside of this area, the median income is $60,000. Well, just like go into New York here and try to find one that's a DAC, which is really hard one this time. Just, come on. There was somewhere that was like $20,000. And, there's legitimate things and reasons why New York City is more burdened than others. And so that's what we're trying to get at here, is like, okay, in this case, with the statewide one, you're going to see more neighborhoods, communities being designated a DAC if you just let the chips fall where they are.
So Alex, just have your cake and eat it too scenario. That was the one where, are you saying we keep the full coverage here on New York City?
Mm-hmm.
And
I'll say do both. So in this case, it's like, okay, with statewide, that means like New York City gets a ton here. And then you also run the same model. So you're running it twice and then basically saying like, I want both. And then I ran this model and said, okay, rest of state, you get some too. And New York City, you get some too. And then basically we take this additional part right here. Ta-da. Oh, come on. This is what happens when you do things on the fly. This is the cake and eat it too idea.
So what percentage of overall census tracts, and I know we have yet to decide what percentage, but this would be, am I correct to believe, this would be more, we would be deciding to include a higher percentage of overall census tracts.
So in this scenario, how this, this will change as the data changes. In this scenario, all these boxes were 25%. When we did the combined boxes, it ended up at 32%. So it wasn't a huge shift. And we do have a slide later on, how big the box is in different economic regions of the state.
Yeah.
I have a question. So in terms of designating a DAC, I guess I'm wondering, what is the harm in this process of identifying the DAC across the state? I guess the question for me really is the other question that we raised in terms of investment and investment percentage. So like, call the DACs what they are, all across the state. But the real question is, how are the investments going to be doled out? Am I missing that?
Yep. No, you're totally not missing that. And in fact, I think that's going to be the critical thing to weigh some of these options, right? So we're teeing up a lot of these because they're going to be really important, especially once we A, get that discussion about investments and benefits, and B, get the final data that we need to make these scenarios really informative. But Amy, you're totally right. Like, if this is the case, whatever you choose, it's the amount of money that goes into and the investments made into these communities. And so if you choose to constrain it one way and really say like, no, it just has to be the top 25% of communities and they have to be in a statewide model, then that's where the money goes, in different ways. And so if you expand it to 30%, then the potential for, the less amount of money, or money goes different places and there's less for each person potentially.
Well, and I guess my other question about this sort of designation versus investment is that there is value in the designation beyond the state investment. So if areas are officially designated, there are opportunities for those regions to receive private funding, to receive federal funding that might be outside the New York State investment. So I guess what I'm wondering is, why not call the DACs what they are and then have this conversation about investment, which is, really the next, goes to what Eddie was talking about, which is the oversized, burden that New York City has.
There's a lot of what Amy just said that really resonates for me. Is it fair to say that and don't judge that I'm leaning into the cake analogy because I'm getting hungry, but the have your cake and eat it too scenario, that feels less arbitrary than some of the other scenarios. And the thing that worries me the most is in the interest of attempting to appear that we're being more even-handed, my worry are actual DAC communities that get denied real resources or attention, or as Amy said, it isn't just about the funding, it's also about permit renewals. It's about, like, there are tangible benefits that we can get beyond the funding, right? And for me, let's use New York City as an example, right? We have in New York City what our neighbors upstate and Western New York and across the state don't have, right? We've got a big city budget, right? Like, we have potentially other sources of revenue to kind of meet but But that doesn't speak to the other benefits that Amy's pointing out, right? We don't want to leave any DAC behind. Like that's where I'm kind of like leaning at the moment. But when we start getting to the more, another example about the investment part that we've not touched on this call, but has been raised repeatedly, right? What happens with indigenous people? What happens with the tribal connection to this whole thing, right? Like we've been saying all along, how can we have a disadvantaged community conversation and not include indigenous peoples in New York State? What we were told in response, and in fact, this is similar to, it sounds like what happened in California, where New York State as an entity is trying to figure out how to engage with tribal nations on the overarching, all of CLCPA, right? That's okay, but that engagement hasn't happened yet, right? The way California, I think from what I remember in the last session, was California actually did not include indigenous communities, tribal areas in their investment, but what they did do to make sure that they weren't completely being racist and like ignoring, they set up a pot of money specifically for their tribal commitments, which we haven't talked about here either. So, but that's part of my worry, is that there are whole sections of New York State that would normally fall into disadvantaged communities that aren't even part of this conversation at the moment. But yeah, the overarching concern is, however we ultimately include indigenous populations in New York State, at bottom, we have to find a way that we can't just say to a disadvantaged community that's truly disadvantaged, yeah, you're somehow advantaged and this will not reach you. That was not the intention of the legislation. So I'll stop there.
Joe, you're totally on point there. And I think one of the things that one of the advantages we have in New York State and this approach is frankly this whole working group coming together and also ensuring that we have very specific entities into this vulnerability score that come in that California isn't allowed to put in, that we have to talk through the underinvestment, the extreme racism and redlining that has happened historically. And by the way, in the maps that you will see, one of the things that we have had, and this is, the redlining data is not there for every single census tract in our maps, but where we do have it, we actually have the score so that you can compare and look at. We're trying to actually pull this in so you have some information that will help you compare those that are DAC versus not, and give you some places to assess this. But what I'm also hearing from you, and I think from everyone, is this need to grapple with investments, benefits, and then also how that affects the choices that you make. And so this May 10th.
By the way, one last point, Alex, I'm so sorry. We keep, and I want to make sure this is part of the conversation as well. We've been talking, as is the want of this group, right, about the 35 to 40%. Let's remember that just because, if communities are not disadvantaged communities at the end of this process, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be eligible for funding. There's 60% of the rest of the funding that's going to be up for grabs, right? We're talking about targeting the funding. So I just want folks to remember that, at the end of this, there are going to be opportunities for non-DAC communities to draw down clean energy funding. Most of the funding is going to be for non-DAC communities. So I just wanted to flag that, because I want us to recognize that, there's a whole pot of 60% of the rest of this that we're not talking about. So sorry.
It's just a good flag. And it's something that I was going to make this graphic about, 60% still goes to a large amount. So that's why, to me, this whole, I had this brain fizz as I was looking at this, and I was like, Amanda, why can't we have our cake and eat it too type of scenario? Because it just felt so viscerally right. And that was, something that we're going to have, right? We're going to try to have those moments where we're be as expansive as possible, but also as scientifically rigorous as possible to try to narrow things in. And so this is one of those decisions that will have to be made. But I too like the leave no DAC behind idea here. in this, we then also have to balance the last question I have for you. So again, no decisions need to be made here, and I just want you all to be thinking through these different options that happen so that we're, again, being as transparent as possible of how you can change this. And this does feel right to me, but it needs to feel right to you guys. It needs to feel like the correct part. Okay, the last question I have is...
Can I just follow up, Alex, on what you just said about that we don't have to make any decisions?
Today.
I kind of feel like that's part of a problem that we're having. Like oftentimes, like it's like we don't need to make a decision, and then things just get moved down the line, and then we have to rediscuss all over again. So we just had like a very in-depth presentation, a very in-depth discussion. And if we don't start making decisions on some of these things, we're just kicking the can down the road. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I'm there with you. What I don't want you to do is make that decision without looking at the data with the final indicators in it. So that's the thing that's holding me back from being like, okay, that, and also having that investment and benefits conversation. I totally wish that today was like, after last month's meeting, I really wanted today to be the day that we were able to start tackling some of these, but it has to be a tee up. And it's like, I get that frustration. We need to make some of these decisions. Today can't be it because you don't have all the data. And it would be disingenuous of me to like force you guys to make a decision on some of these things when you don't have all the pieces yet. I really wish we did. Really wish we did. Because there are so many pieces and so many decisions you have to make. Okay. So anything else before I jump to the next one? Any thoughts? Okay, we got 18 minutes left, and there's really just one more part I want to cover and then kind of talk about next steps again before we move on. And I know, again, that the delay of not having all the data is really pushing us back, and it's, trust me, I get it, it's frustrating. This is the last one I want to talk about. As we move into adding some of those climate risk indicators into the data, one of the things that we run a huge risk of is actually having some areas that are highly vulnerable to climate change be pushed into the kind of DAC way. And so this is a very extreme example because I literally try to choose the most extreme example possible in this case to make that clear. But there are big flood and storm surge issues that could happen for like, say, the East Hampton Village area. And what we want to make sure doesn't happen is in our calculations as we do things that they get considered a DAC because of that high environmental burden that they have.
I'm sorry, Alex, but the law itself, I don't want to get ahead, and I don't want to tip my hand that I actually sometimes look at your PowerPoints before the actual meeting, but the very last slide of your presentation has the definitions from the CLCPA. And if they talk about poverty, wouldn't the definition of the law preclude East Hampton from being included?
It better, yeah.
So, yeah, poverty, race, a legacy of health issues, like, you know, like I don't even understand the question.
Okay, well, I think what we were I'm so glad we're on the same page. This is probably this like, okay, we don't have to talk about it. What worries us is like if we set up this whole like, okay, we've got the burdens calculation, we've got the population calculation, and then we get some numbers spit out, and then all of a sudden this burdens risk is huge for some places, that the population vulnerabilities gets obfuscated or like overwhelmed.
But there's a difference between being susceptible to extreme weather events and being a DAC. There's a complete difference, right? You know,
totally.
Eddie was talking about the 60%. 60% plus privilege equals opportunity that they have, that low-income communities that have been faced with a legacy of environmental racism do not. So I don't know why we're having this convo. I'm sorry.
Because I just need.
I haven't eaten and I haven't had coffee, so I'm sorry.
I think
No,
Alex is
it's
saying
okay.
that. I think Alex is saying is there a scenario under which this math that we're doing, right, would end up with the Hamptons? And I'm just wondering if the definition, as you were saying, Elizabeth, the definition in the law itself, wouldn't that trump, or maybe not? Like
No,
it's.
don't use that word. Don't use that word. It triggers me. It triggers me.
Never mind.
Well, okay,
Sorry.
let me be
Yeah.
clear here. We are all on the same page. I just wanted to confirm that we're all on the same page, because what we want to do is take this and make it the most, like, an important thing, so that what the East Hamptons do not get designated this way, because this is important. So what I want to say is that I just want us to all be very transparent of the fact that if in other places in California, other places like that, this could have happened, and we need to make sure it doesn't. That's all I want to say on this. And if you guys are cool with that, then we can move on and drink coffee.
Yeah, so there's different ways to do that, but we wanted to hear this conversation to understand if we do need, a threshold criteria that says even after we put everything else, there's a way to say, okay, some of these, even though they scored that way, we need to put this additional filter on it. Hate to say trump card, but basically a trump card that says, some criteria like low income, BIPOC, and you could define those criteria, are the final filter. So we can either play with weights and importance of things and the multiplication, or just figure out some super key variables and just layer them on.
Okay. Well, clearly I left the easiest for last, because we're all just so clearly okay with that one. You got to call these things out sometimes and make sure it's absolutely okay for us to make sure we do this so that it is true to the legislation, true to the area. I want to leave you with this, and that is that, as we look through all of these different parts, it's not easy. I think if anyone wants to ground truth this right now and let us know with what we have, again, not sufficient data, but does it feel right? Are we getting the right places? Of course, you have no names on here, so apologies for that.
I'll say, Alex, one thing I'm thinking of as someone who represents northern Manhattan, particularly when we take out the green, probably one of the more vulnerable areas that I would say exists in northern Manhattan gets taken out.
Okay, cool.
So for me personally, I would have a concern about losing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that is exactly what we want to know when you look at the map. So then our next question would be you don't have to write this now, but okay, what is it about that community that, what are you seeing in that community that either has a higher burden and a higher vulnerability? So we understand really what's happening on the ground there. And then we can say, okay, does our data account for that? What are the values of these things in this data? Is there a missing variable? Why are we not picking that up?
Do you want me to answer it now or in a different part of this process?
Both. I think we just want all those data. And so you gave some ground truthing, which was really, really helpful for us in assessing this. So, if you want to point me to the right one, I will.
Alex, but part of the problem with at least in New York City is that some of us are good. We ain't that good. I can't look at census block X, Y, and Z and tell you it's the corner of Starrett, and I can't. And I don't know if there's any way when we do the ground truthing tutorial. I don't know if there's any way to do even a slight overlay that at least identifies the neighborhoods in New York City. Yeah, totally. Like that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I forgot I wasn't on mute. Sorry.
No, it's all good. I think so. One of the things that we're still building out is how to make this as useful for you as possible, as in the neighborhood names, which is actually really hard for us to pull in consistently. But we've got some of it, and one of the things that I was thinking of doing was to make this a little it's not perfect, right? But you'll be able to see a little better this way if, say, I zoom into here. Now you can see some of the street names and you'll be able to be like, oh yeah, that totally fits, right? Part of the reason why we don't have that background map when I'm doing the presentations is just because I want you to see the color pop. But for the actual, like, you assessing things, this will be the map that you look at. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. And I feel like we covered a lot. I'm hoping, and please tell me, I'm hoping that these maps are helping to explain some of these different concepts. And I know that they're still hard. And part of the reason it's so hard is that there's lots of little levers that we can pull to like change the outcome of things, right? We can change the percentage of the amount of communities that we say are DACs, or we can change the regional kind of thing. So those are two different levers that we can pull that will change things. And so part of it is just like there's a lot of interplay between those different parts. So bear with us as we try to explain this. It's not easy to kind of try to cover all the different moving parts together. That said, I really value all of your.
Oh, Alex, can you go back for a second?
Yeah, yeah.
Hey, could you go back for a second and just go to the North Bronx, north of? I just need to make sure. This is one of the ground truthing pieces I was going to do. I just want to make sure. Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is. I don't know if we have time to do this now, but it would be maybe really helpful after the call to send around a doodle so we could pick a time for the tutorial next week.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's send the doodle right after this so that we can pick a time and go through, and then make it work.
Like, I don't understand why the blocks around Bronx Community College is not like. There's no way that's not a DAC community. You know what I mean? Like, it's just. Anyway, but I'll stop. That's for the tutorial. I'll stop now.
Full disclaimer, remember, we still have so many things that need to be pulled in here, right? So like, I feel like these maps aren't right yet, and they can't be, but they're illustrative. Oh, that's a good word.
Knowing, like, you don't have to, like, we can help figure out why. We just need to know, I don't understand why census tract ABC isn't in here, and then we can say, okay, what is the data there versus its neighbors?
Mm-hmm. And how does that work? Yeah. And what's nice about this is that, yeah, we can start pulling that in and getting that information. Okay. 7 minutes left. Any other comments, thoughts? We just showed you a lot, and also the timeline. So I'm going to leave you again with the timeline. Well, actually, I want to show you a couple things. So we built this out to have a lot of information in here. One thing I think that you all may really find valuable, particularly with the conversation of the California last time, is the similarities and then the differences of what we are doing as opposed to CalEnviroScreen. Amy, this gets to your point on like the DACs and things. CalEnviroScreen was used as a screening tool. And in this case, with the legislation, identify and designate communities was what we are undertaking for the legislation. But I think what you are also saying is, like, it's more important even than that. It's also like it helps to channel funding in other places and identify things. So I really like that, because it's basically both at that point, right? So it can be used as a screening tool, but also as a designation. I wanted to point this out just so you know. And then I'm going to leave you with, sorry to make you all dizzy, this wonderful slide that, again, just talking about the timeline, and a big thank you, because we know that this is a big ask. We are putting in a huge time investment as well, and it's just so darn important. We recognize that we're asking a lot. So let us know what we can do to help facilitate this, in addition to what I'm going to say is, like, we have that map tutorial, but then we also make a commitment to getting you content as soon as possible. I can't say, like, it's going to be a week beforehand or not, depending on when we get the data that we get. But we will work really hard to get you things beforehand so that you have the time. And then also make ourselves available whenever you need to kind of chat through things. Those one-on-ones are very helpful. We can turn them around really quickly. So whenever you have a free moment, I will make myself available to chat through these different components.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for this presentation. I can tell from the comment box that working group members were very appreciative of the information you were able to convey this way. So last thing we'll note for next steps, you will be receiving lots of things, including the package on the first batch of panel recommendations, the finalized dates for May. We're gonna send out a poll so we can get a tutorial on our calendars on the Tableau tool. And we're also gonna have a poll so we can finalize the June and July dates. So everybody has their calendar set for the upcoming meetings. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you all again.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.